Good evening, everyone. My name is Mimi Plochet. I'm Artistic Director of the Chicago International Film Festival, and it is my pleasure to be here in conversation today with director Phyllida Lloyd and writer and lead actor Clare Dunne. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks, Mimi. It's great to be here.
I also wanted to thank you all for joining us here for the screening and Q&A, and also thank Amazon Studios for sharing this film with our members. So I want to get started talking about this question of collaboration. I feel that the theme of collaboration is very strong in the film, or this coming together of community and working together. And while in the film, the collaboration is not exclusive to exclusively women, I think to a degree, the film is also about sisterhood and women coming together to support each other. And of course, filmmaking is very collaborative as an art. And with the case of herself, there's, of course, the two of you leading the production, but also so many women at the center of this film. So I was wondering if you could just start talking about the process of collaboration and working collaboratively together on the film.
Claire and I, when Claire began writing the screenplay, we were actually already collaborating in an all-female theatre company. We were performing Shakespeare set in women's prisons, and very preoccupied by the kind of world we were building, the community we were building in which we were making our work. And I think the keynote was that how you work is as critical as the work you make. And it was a kind of life-changing 5 years. We were working with women in prison and becoming very preoccupied with the number of women whose roots into the criminal justice system had come against a background of domestic abuse. But collaboration, that collaboration between us and with Harriet Walter, who played Peggy in the film. Claire and Harriet had played husband and wife and warrior enemies and father and son. So by the time we came to make the movie, we really were deep friends and colleagues, and that kind of permeated it. You know, there's the word mehel at the center of the film, the Irish word for helping your neighbors out, and somehow the crew that made the movie were a mehel that came together to make the movie, with a very strong sense that Claire was this star, you know, Irish theatre star. They all knew her. She was very popular in the city, but everybody knew she had not really had a break on screen. So there was a kind of great feeling of solidarity and investment. And I'd wanted to do a lower budget film because I felt I could get that same investment that I get in the theatre from a smaller unit in that way.
Yeah, Claire, could you talk about your experience with this, especially maybe as how it relates to, as Phyllida was saying, like coming out of theater and kind of the spirit of collaboration that exists there, both working together, but in other experiences as well?
Yeah, I definitely think because of the themes in the film and what we were working on, and although I was like, I had to play Sandra and therefore be in every scene, it wasn't like some sort of mega star vehicle, and there wasn't some sort of dictatorship style thing going on. It was very about a gentle kind of support team around Sandra, but actually about the ensemble working together. And there were many moments on set where a runner or a lighting assistant would come up to me and say, Phyllida asked me what I thought about that. And I thought, yeah, like it's been about ultimate collaboration all the way, and inclusivity. And I think that's been very important to the making of the film. I would say along the way as well, I learned a lot about collaboration, and actually a lot of it is about, I mean, certainly when you're a writer, every draft you do, you're letting go of old writing and invoking some new. And so I guess there's an element of like not hanging on to things too much, not letting your ego get in the way. And I feel like actually there was a similar attitude for everyone on set. Like there was a kind of thing of like nobody really held on to something, you know, or hung on too tight to the lines. Like there was room for improvising and breathing, and working together in the moment and finding a solution to something because the location was dictating a certain thing or the weather was. And I feel like that spirit infused the whole thing, definitely.
Great. And this is the first screenplay that you've written. Can you talk about that process for you? And then, inhabiting the character that you wrote and created.
Yeah, look, I hadn't written for screen. I'd written a couple of things for stage by the time I kind of got the lightning bulb flash of this story through my mind. But I certainly wasn't like experienced in any way. I'd just been reading a lot of scripts, and I realized that you kind of knew sometimes from the first page, but certainly the first few pages, where the voice of this writer was coming from, what their world vision was, what the tone of a piece was. And I think I just developed a higher sensor in myself of like what's good writing and bad writing to me, not anyone else. And I think that was quite a heightened thing inside of me when I suddenly was like, I'm going to write this story. And so because I was very clear about something, about the tone and about where it was going to be coming from, and because it was kind of inspired by my best friend's situation, who was struggling to find a home in Dublin at the time, I suppose I just knew that much. And then it was a question of researching, meeting people to talk about the subjects in the film, like domestic violence and self-building, etc. And then also just, reading some of the old school books about screenwriting and literally learning very practically how to use Final Draft. I mean, I had to learn everything from scratch. So I felt like I aligned quite well with Sandra building a house. So I was definitely like Sandra, not knowing anything at the start, but learning along the way.
Right. You just brought up like the two really, I think, important issues that are clearly connected in the film, which is domestic violence and then the lack of affordable housing, not just for victims or subjects of domestic violence, but just across the board. I think, we have a general understanding, I think, especially in the type of maybe cinema that we show at the festival, that in this power of storytelling and stories and the way in which they have the capacity to engender or bring about change, both maybe in the viewer on an individual level, but then there's this also greater possibility for larger social change. Can you talk a little bit about kind of thinking about that and creating the film or working together on the film? And maybe, the way that relates to the project that you worked on with the Shakespeare trilogy. And then also, I guess, the rollout of the film, because it's just going into theaters now, and the idea or kind of thoughts around a social impact campaign around the film. So those are, I guess, two separate questions, but both related to kind of film as kind of engendering social change.
I mean, I think that we were both, first of all, in the work we've been doing in the theatre, we were hell-bent on putting hidden voices, making hidden voices public. And for me, this was a kind of continuum of that. But what really struck me when I read the screenplay was we've seen the story of the voiceless woman, the so-called battered woman treated in on screen, in fiction, etc. But I hadn't read the story where I felt that the writer was speaking not just to those of us who may well be safe in our homes, but have the power or the empathy to reach out for a neighbour, look out for that person in the apartment who we're slightly worried about upstairs. But that she was also speaking to the women themselves. And I felt that is what gives the film its very distinctive tone. It gives it its sense of possibility rather than the hopelessness of the system. This is got what if? What if we came together? What if the woman wasn't a victim, but actually she was an agent of her own change? And it's not that it's a fairy tale and things land in her lap. She is driving the ideas, and then luck, of course, comes to her and the community come to her, but it's her energy and her will. So I suppose there's a sort of double mission here. There is we've all got to be better neighbours. We want the audience to be thinking, especially now, am I a good enough neighbour? But we also want, and as filmmakers, we're of course craving the big screen for our movie. But I really feel now, actually, let's just get this through. Feel it. It's almost like a letter we're sending. Get it through the letterbox, get it onto the laptop, because there may be women, or there are women now, thousands all over the world, whose experience of domestic trauma is intensified by the pandemic. And maybe this offers just can movies save lives? I don't know, but it can maybe say, we're hearing you, we're listening.
Right. And Claire, did you want to add to that in any way?
Yeah, like I kind of echo what Phyllida said. When we used to do workshops with lovely women in prison who had such like incredible stories about their lives, I suppose on some level I wondered what it'd be like for this film to be on the telly in their cell. And because I don't think it's as simple as like, there's definitely hope, or you can just do this, or you can just do that. It's more to do with, as Phyllida was saying, a genuine listening to their spirit and what they actually have been through and the level of what they've been through, and just even that act of empathy, and then just the imagine if thing. And it's like, it's almost like I see it, like I fantasize that it's almost like a lighthouse just putting out a signal, and if they happen to see it, they go, oh, okay, actually that's a different way of thinking about that. And I always thought of those women, because one of the first people I ever spoke to was a woman in a women's aid charity shop, and she literally grabbed me by the arm when I told her what I was doing and said, please tell the story of all of us that move on from the partner. Please don't paint us as a victim. Please don't do that. And I mean, she begged me, like, put her hands on my arms, and I was like, okay, I'll do that. And so it is a direct line. Like, I am listening to that woman and then writing for her. So that's kind of what I hoped for. And yeah.
Yeah, and I know, victim isn't the right word, and truly we see that in the film because it's a story of empowerment, really, and self-discovery. But it's, also the way that you depict it is that it's not something that is done alone. You both talked about the tone of the film, and, Claire, you just saying you were pretty clear in, after reading all the scripts, what you wanted the tone to be. And Phyllida, you saying it's, and I felt this too, that it sets the film apart from other films that deal with, the same issues of particularly domestic violence. So I felt it was quite unique. And of course, there's of course very serious and real moments of gravity, but it's interspersed with a lot of levity and humor, and I think true moments of grace and beauty, particularly in the scenes of Sandra and her two daughters, at the very beginning with the makeup and, the singing in the kitchen and dancing. And, it felt both so relatable, but also quite touching. What were the conversations, or at first, I guess, Claire, in your head, what was the conversation you were having with yourself about creating this tone and striking that balance, and then translating that to the film?
I think that there was just a certain point in the journey where, openings of films are difficult anyway, or like you really want to get it right, or just grab the audience in the right way. And I think I realized after a certain amount of time, my instinct was telling me, show Sandra with the little universe of love and protection that she like this little mini universe that she creates for her children, and how she's somehow trying to maintain that within a bit of a war front in the home. And just show that first, and maybe end with her and her children as well. Like, I used to just have this instinct that was the right way to go. And then once we were all sort of agreed on that, I think we realized, okay, let's not just, because at first I just had them sort of dancing in the kitchen and having the crack and being quite like hyper. And actually, it was Phyllida and Rose and Malcolm that kind of helped me see there could be also a tender way in and a more gentle thing. There's also like the practical thing of explaining my birthmark, which happens to look like a black eye. So it's like I happen to be playing this battered woman that we don't want to appear as a battered woman. So it was like, how do you usually explain your birthmark to your nieces and nephews? And I kind of told the funny story of how I say, you know, in God's pocket, etc. And actually, then it kind of organically grew into this great way of surreptitiously letting the audience know when the kids go, there's loads of Sandras in Dublin. It's like there's loads of Sandras that we just don't see and we don't know about. So it was actually a lovely way of setting up something subconsciously as well in the audience's mind, and giving them the feeling of quiet and tenderness and safety and gentleness of touch just before the kind of thriller moments. Yeah, and I suppose also just seeing Sandra's love for her kids, which is sort of her driving force and motivation to get her going in general.
Right. And then Phyllida, was there, like, in the editing room, were there specific changes or ways that you talked about kind of striking that balance?
I think that the tone of sort of light and dark, of kind of comedy and tragedy, was something that was there in the screenplay. It was very much as well part of my DNA in this world we were working in, where death and laughter lay very closely side by side. You didn't need to kind of homogenize the whole thing in a sort of with a bleak tone, as it were. And I had started in the edit in a rather, when we started temping music onto the film, for example, I think we began in a world that was quite perhaps generic, perhaps a sort of slightly more received idea of what a film that was dealing with this subject you might expect, a more haunting, Celtic kind of minor key world. And then Clare and I began talking about, you know, Sandra had an iPod in early drafts, and music was really important to her. And we knew she was going to sing at the end of the movie, but there was always music around and music in the house. And so that's how we began to sort of experiment with music and then silence, so that there was no question but that we were going to put sort of anything sentimental under, you know, the scenes with the children, or we were just going to leave their chatter or leave their conversation with Sandra completely without anything kind of sweetening it. And yet we were going to kind of let rip with a soundtrack that contained a lot of Sandra's past, you know, the music that she and Gary, the festival stuff, the big banger hits that they had gone mental to, and then the children were mad about Sia, and it grew out of that. And it's quite a kind of it makes the contrast between the moments of safety, you know, the moments of the highs and the lows are quite kind of exaggerated in some way, but it felt that it was there in the screenplay, this idea that she would achieve a certain amount, but there was always Gary, there was always this threat, this menace that was lurking, that was going to kind of keep bringing her down.
Yeah, and I was really interested in the choice. This relates to this, of the way to shoot kind of the scene of domestic violence, because you know, we only see certain parts of it, but we do have this understanding that the backstory is slowly revealed through through the narrative, but we also understand her trauma, and that there's more that not only happened in that scene, but that's also reflecting back to a past of trauma that's both maybe physical as well as psychological. So can you talk about kind of the decisions of how to shoot that scene and represent that?
I mean, that was a big journey in the edit. We shot something very much more it would have been too much to have included it. It was just a horrifying sequence, which Claire and Ian, made actually really practically together. But when cut, it was horrific. And I did do a lot of there was a lot of back and forth in my head about how much to show and what to show when. But then I'm sure in conversation with Claire, the decision to follow the PTSD and go, this is a woman who's blocking out something absolutely critical that is going to be revealed to her, not just for plot purposes, but because that's what the healing process is going to do. It's going to allow her to eventually be able to remember the fundamental thing that her child witnessed, what had happened. And so it was about just these kind of stabs and eking out, that her system could only just take certain attacks of this, and then her hatches would batten down. And that's why we decided to show really comparatively little. And we also knew that the audience would do so much and bring so much. When they saw the child running with the safety box, they knew something catastrophic was either about to happen or had happened. So it was a case of just distilling, paring back more and more and more.
Great. I wanted to move on to talk a little bit about the legend of St. Bridget, which is, again, shown in this moment of tenderness with the storytelling of Molly, I should say the retelling of it in her own words, her own version. Can you talk about kind of that moment where you realized that the legend of St. Bridget was such a perfect for this story?
Yeah, it was weird. It was kind of early in the process, and it was a really strange instinct one night that I was trying to find a way for Emma to tell her mother a story, and just invert the mother telling the child a story thing. And I wanted to just play with that arena because I felt like Sandra was obsessed with telling her children a better story about what the world entails for a girl growing up. And I just had this instinct to look her up, and it was kind of mad because there's obviously a Catholic version and a pagan version, but who knows? I'd say the lads in the church just kind of made up the Catholic version after that was already decided. So it turns out she was one of the most amazing people at helping the poor, and she treated everybody equally. Anyone that spoke to her, she always replied to. She is symbolized in these statues in Kells as she puts her foot on the sword and her hand holding out for peace. She's just this amazing woman, and she was also just very practical. So she goes to the king, obviously, and you hear the story of the film of Emma saying, asking for a piece of land and all this kind of thing. But there is records, and she did actually get land and then help people build houses for themselves and farm. And they literally did grow a lot of berries on the land and make jam. That did happen. So I kind of couldn't believe this woman sort of existed and was actually quite practical. And I love that about her. Very earthy. And I love the way in the Catholic versions, she's a pure nun. And in the pagan versions, she took to bed with another nun. So she's actually also amazing and bisexual, apparently, according to the pagan version. So I just loved the idea of this this story coming from the daughter to the mother, and that sparking inspiration. And that it's not just a saint that's quite magical. It's somebody that did something quite practical like they do in the film. It was kind of too good to be true, too good to be used.
Yeah, and just the story of St. Bridget is that land means power or self-empowerment and independence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also read that, St. Bridget's one of the patron saints of poets in Ireland. And I did want to talk about the poetry of, especially the use of metaphor and symbolism in the film, whether it's kind of the building of the house representing a rebuilding of her life, or the ending with the fire and kind of that sense of rising from the ashes and renewal. I guess, can you talk about kind of the use of metaphor throughout the film?
Yeah, like originally I had a very strange version of this film at one point where it was literally her having dreams about St. Bridget and being inspired by all this stuff in her dreams. But I needed to root it and make it more real and just practical. So that's how it eventually got to that place with Emma telling the story. And so actually I didn't like concentrate too heavily on holding on to poetry or symbolism, but eventually it just started to happen naturally. Like Peggy's character was originally a woman in her 40s that was more closer to Sandra's age, and she was just working for her. And then I realized actually she needs to be an older generation and almost like a good witch. And so then there was all this stuff about good witches that then was something that I read up on. Because the banshee is always considered a bad thing in Ireland, and actually it can be a good thing. And then in terms of other symbolism with the house, yeah, I mean, look, I read so much about houses and how they're actually a universe that you create for your children. It's about what happens between the walls, not just the house itself. So, and how houses can hold energy, how you build them affects how people move and flow and communicate with each other. So that became more of a, I don't know, probably an architecture obsession. But then the fire, and I hope this is like Q&A.
It is Q&A, yeah. Everybody.
Spoiler alert. I think the fire was quite simply, the fire of transformation. It was also the idea of Ian's character Gary not being just such a monster, but a monster that actually he destroys himself to actually better the whole of humanity and the society around him. So sometimes there's an element of destruction and destroying things, knocking things down because we want to build them anew. Right. And actually, that's kind of what that symbolizes as well. Right. So, but on a very simplistic level, or rather the way I saw it when the night I realized the fire had to happen, was that Sandra's world, like she was like a planet going around a sun that was Gary, and everything was about him, everything was about him. Then eventually it was the house, and it was like everything was about the house. So she was the earth rotating around this thing. I have to build a house, that's going to fix everything, and then I'll be grand, and then I'll be grand. And so when one destroys the other, she realizes she has to be the sun. So it's about her realizing like just that she's okay as she is and accepts where she is at that point. Accepts this whole thing with Gary is part of her life, but not the definition of her life. So right. I realized it had to be about her in the end. And the irony that I never even named the film herself is ridiculous. But it really is about herself in the end, in terms of just acceptance and accepting all these new people and the new kind of love and the trustworthy love and the new relationships as well. Yeah. So I probably answered that in a very long way. I mean,
no, that's great. And Phyllida, I was wondering if you could also talk a little bit about translating, I know we're running out of time, but that poetry to the visual sense, which I think that we get very strongly, like I said, particularly in those moments of like beauty and grace.
Yes, I mean, I felt that there was a really strong, for me, mythic undertow to the piece. I felt that from the moment Molly, the child, spoke the truth about St. Bridget, that sort of unlocked Sandra's future, and that my keynote really was to stay close to Sandra and try to enter a room with Sandra and leave with her, and not, you know, whatever happened in her absence, we were not going to know about it. So it wasn't shot in a self-consciously from her point of view, but I wanted to stay really, really close and simplify everything as much as I possibly could. So quite a lot of scenes are shot in one shot, which, as all filmmakers know, actually takes 5 times as long as, you know, shooting in with 5 setups, because especially when children are there, although I have to say I can't blame the children for any time wasting at all, because they were the most extraordinary old heads on young shoulders who, you know, you say cut and they immediately went straight back to their first marks, ready for the next take. But yes, there was, you know, whenever I sort of, I mean, I think about that last shot of as Claire's describing that Sandra is now the sun, that somehow the camera went very low and you saw her in that, she was looking up at the sky in this kind of, she was Saint Bridget by the end. And the children were like her little novices kind of scrabbling around, you know, getting nails for her. So some of the decisions, and obviously the house itself was at the poetic center of this, and it growing and it changing color and it in the storm. These were a series of kind of canvases against which the community was burrowing, and actually starting with scraping the grass, literally with Conleth driving the digger, scraping the grass off that field, and then really illogically having to go away and shoot, you know, other scenes in another part of Dublin while we built the foundations. And every time we came back to the location, and suddenly there was the frame of the house, you know, the crew and actors, everybody would just gasp as if, you know, it was like we were returning to some kind of shrine, or some sort of evolving, not church, but it was like a church. It was going to hold all of us, and it held the hopes of both the characters and the crew. And so when it was destroyed, you know, the actors, we had very little time to destroy it before Dublin itself was destroyed. So I had to be very, very judicious about how to shoot that. But I felt in my heart that the poetry of that fire was going to be sort of absolutely searing for the actors. And, you know, I think they stared at it with a loss that was entirely real. That we'd made this thing, and people used to say, "Oh, are we going to leave the house here and give it to somebody?" And we were like, "No, because we're going to destroy it." But it was that was the metaphor. You know, she was rebuilding herself. She was rebuilding a house, but she was rebuilding herself, and the house was where the kind of beyond Sandra herself. Sandra and the children were at the poetic heart, but the house was a kind of another very strong image. And Dominic, who designed the house with its layers of color and in a way gave us something that had a poetry of its own.
Yeah. Great. I think that's a beautiful way to end it. Thank you. Well, first of all, congratulations on the film. We're excited that our audiences finally have the opportunity to see it. And congratulations, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much.